mean, maybe as a whole group we could say everybody group skim and find the earliest date and the latest.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So so maybe that could be step one. And then they place it on a timeline, and we might find that they're switching the post-it notes as they learn from other sequencing.
So the reason that I asked teachers in the second institute to develop their own activities rather than participating in another demo lesson is that I think it's very important to practice the modeling that goes along with each part of the reading lesson. The teachers are going to be planning a reading lesson based on a text that they've already read. There's 3 parts to it. 2 parts are pre-reading activities. 1 part is creating a vocabulary activity for some of the words that are in the text. The second part is creating a prediction guide, which is designed to activate and build student background knowledge and also create a purpose for reading. And then the third activity is a timeline activity. It's a during reading activity. A timeline is a type of graphic organizer. It gets students back into the text to pull out important information, in this case, dates for important events.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and begin our pre-reading by looking at some of the vocabulary in the text that we studied for today. And we've pulled out some words from the text, and we're going to go over some ways of teaching these words and learning these words. First thing we want to do, though, is rate your word knowledge. So I'm going to say a word, and I'm going to ask you how well you know this word. The first word we're going to do is independence. How many people, is this the first time you've seen this word? How many of you have heard the word independence before, but you don't quite know what it means? Okay, so we're going to move into taking a look at the word independence and getting to know it a little bit better. First, I'm going to say the word for you, independence. Now I'm going to ask you to repeat the word after me. Independence.
Independence.
The way that independence is defined, and we've connected it to the reading that we're working, is if independence is freedom. And independence is when you're not under someone else's control. So write that down in your word journal. And then I'm going to give you an example of how I would use the word. I recognized my independence when I moved out of my parents' house. So work with your partner for a few minutes and talk about when you recognize your independence. Amory, would you turn to John and say, so when did you recognize your independence? John, so when did you recognize your independence?
I recognized my independence when I got my first job.
Good. And let's hear one more.
Hilda, when did you recognize your independence?
I recognized my independence when I passed my driver's test.
So I feel like we have a really good understanding of the word now. We're moving along in our understanding of the word. You were able to use it in your own sentences. And now when you see it in text, you'll recognize it and know what it means.
Beautiful. The vocabulary group really led us through some very concrete steps for teaching words. She gave a personal example, and then what?
Then students gave.
So in pairs, we came up with an example. So it wasn't just come up with an example of independence.
It was a sentence starter.
Right, a sentence starter, right. And also sort of explain to us their process in choosing words, why they chose them, and why they introduced them that way. Okay.
And we tried to choose more high utility words as well that they would run into in other situations.
And then you came back at the end and said, oh, look, now we're all over on the far side of the chart. Now we know the word. So it's kind of helping the students realize, okay, you've done this learning. So kind of reevaluate.
We were given the task of instructing on a prediction guide and using the prediction guides as a pre-reading exercise.
The group that created a prediction guide worked on creating a set of statements that students may know something about, may have misconceptions about, and all the statements are related to important concepts in the text. After reading the text, students return to the prediction guide and they change their answers based on the information that they found in the text.
The idea was we were going to hand out the prediction guides and assign 3 questions to delegations of 3.
Okay.
to somewhat model for them the idea of these delegates coming together and bringing their own ideas and concepts. So the true-false questions, we kind of mixed them up and gave each of the delegations, 3 questions to come up with an answer. We used 3 because it kind of broke the ties. So we wanted to make sure that the delegation had some consensus as to how they were going to deliver the response. As they came back together, what they would do is, prior to reading, the entire group in the room would be able to vote on the answers that were given by the other groups. Subsequent to that, once we tallied up their votes, they would go back and actually do the reading and come together. And again, maybe to develop some consensus as a group.
What's the purpose of the prediction guide?
The purpose of the prediction guide is to first kind of activate their
Background.
background knowledge.
Uh-huh.
And also some of the questions will also ask them to find the answer. So
That's
you're
right.
looking for the answer. So the questions like the ideas of freedom of religion and speech and Bill of Rights came from Voltaire, they'll have to look for it. I wouldn't know the answer to that.
Right.
So it's
Right.
to inspire them to look for the information.
Right. So it's activating background knowledge. It's setting a purpose for reading. Oh, I wonder if this is true or not. And then after they've read, they can come back together. Which ones were right, which ones were wrong. So that's a way they're monitoring their comprehension. Maybe they're going back into the text.
I'm going to ask this table over here. The Navigation Act gave directions to the Port of Boston. So what's our agreement? Okay, as a consensus.
We'll read to find out.
They don't have to be right or wrong necessarily, but the answer has to be in the text. 2 groups of teachers created timeline activities. The important thing about the timeline is not just the graphic organizer itself, but how do you introduce the idea of a timeline to students, and how do you create support for students in extracting the important information from the text. One group of teachers started by asking students to think about their own lives and make a timeline of their own lives so that they could start to understand what makes an event from the past important.
Okay, so we want major events. So what are some typical major events in most of our lives?
First day of school.
First day of school.
Okay.
So anyways, you're demonstrating that. Like, where would it go? Would it go down here? Would it go down here? You put a date here, blah, blah, blah. Okay. So what we want to do is find out our starting date from what we see in this text, from this writing, from Britain and its American colonies to before American creates the Republic. Just look at all the dates and find the earliest date, like your birth, and the latest date. Is there a beginning?
Yes.
Okay. Let's just write that down. Anything later than 81? 1781?
1787.
You're going to do a graphic organizer. We're going to start as a whole group. We're going to read the first section. I'm just going to go through this. A date that you see, who were the big players, what was the big event, who was involved, and why is it important. And then we're going to break you up into groups, and you're going to do it for your section and discuss it and get your graphic organizer written. And then you're going to get Post-it notes and put your date and the event. And we're going to put it on the timeline, and then we can be flexible about the spacing, the order, and then we can argue all day long.
Another group of teachers created a timeline activity that could work for lower level learners. The teachers wrote important events on Post-its and gave them out to students, and then students had to work through the text to find out when did those events happen and post their Post-it on the timeline.
Depending on the level of student, again, maybe if it's a lower level student, you just want them to place it up there. And then you could talk about it, what is it? Or if it's a higher level student, you could have them summarize it in a pair, as in a paragraph. So I want you to summarize what is the Declaration of Independence, and then place it up there. And as you go down the timeline later in the class, the students could come up, present what it is to the rest of the class. Why don't we have students put them up? So your job is to go through the reading as a group and put them in the appropriate place.
You have 2 minutes. Let's go.
1766?
75 was
Yeah, now you got
it was the first count of Congress, and this was after that election.
Still a couple hours.
So that's 75.
Oh, it's a different.
What's nice about the sticky notes is if any of them are not correct, you can always remove them. The other thing we thought was very important as far as a visual and a timeline per se. Rather than plotting the events, you have say 10 events, you're going to break it up into 10 equivalent markers for your dates. It's really, really important, especially, I mean, look at this. If it's important, so we broke up the timeline in 10-year spans, so that, or 5-year, over a 20-year period of time, so that our dates reflected the events and the clustering of events that were happening at certain times. So that's important, especially for many of our students to really be able to see it visually.